She had exactly $43, a bruised jaw she'd been hiding for 3 years, and one desperate plan that could either save her life or destroy it completely. The marriage advertisement was only 9 words long. Mountain man seeks honest woman, no illusions offered. No illusions. For a woman who'd been living inside someone else's lies her whole life, those 3 words hit different. This is the story of Eliza Rowan, a woman who traded everything familiar for something terrifying, a chance. Stay until the end because the moment that changed everything? You won't see it coming. If this story moves you, hit that subscribe button and become part of our family, so you never miss the stories we bring you every week. Drop a like and tell me in the comments what city or country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now, let's begin. The bus station in Harwick smelled like burnt coffee and diesel and something else Eliza couldn't name. Something stale and human that clung to the plastic seats and never quite left. She sat in the far corner, her back against the wall the way Silas had always sat in restaurants, always watching the door. She used to think that habit looked paranoid. Now she understood it completely. Her bag sat between her feet. One bag. 26 years of living reduced to what she could carry in 30 minutes while her brother slept off a bottle of rye in the back room. She'd packed the practical things, 2 changes of clothes, her mother's silver hairbrush, the folder of documents she'd been quietly assembling for 4 months, and the letter. She'd read it so many times the paper had gone soft at the fold lines. I'm not a romantic man and I won't pretend otherwise. I have a cabin in the Frostpine Range roughly 2 days' ride north of Callaway Creek. I trap for a living. The winters are hard and the nearest neighbor is 11 miles east. I'm looking for a partner, not a decoration. If you want honest work and honest company, write back. G. Voss, 9 sentences. That was more than most men had offered her, and most men had offered her a great deal more words than they were worth. She'd written back. They'd exchanged 4 letters over 6 weeks, careful, cautious letters that said more in what they didn't ask than in what they did. He never asked what she was running from. She never asked why a man living alone in the mountains had placed an advertisement in 3 different regional papers. Some things you understood without needing them explained. The bus north left at 4:10 a.m. She had 11 minutes. She almost didn't make it out of the house. She'd been halfway down the back stairs when she heard the floorboard creak above her. That specific creak, the 3rd step from the landing, the one she'd learned to avoid before she was 10 years old. Her whole body went rigid in the dark. Her hand tightened on the strap of her bag until she could feel her own pulse in her palm. Silence. Then the settling sounds of an old house at night. Nothing more. She stood there in the dark for a full minute anyway, not because she needed to, but because her legs had simply stopped working. That was the thing nobody warned you about. Fear wasn't always loud. Sometimes it was just your own body refusing to move, like it had made a separate decision from your brain. Go, she told herself. Go right now, or you never will. She went. The cold outside hit her like a fist, and she almost laughed at the absurdity of it. That walking out of that house into freezing February air felt like the first clean breath she'd taken in years. She walked fast, head down, not running because running attracted attention, and the last thing she needed was someone's porch light snapping on. She didn't look back at the house. She'd promised herself she wouldn't, and that was one promise she intended to keep. The bus was half empty. She took a window seat and watched Harwick slide past in the dark. The feed store where she'd worked for 2 years, the church with the broken gutter, the gas station where Silas had once grabbed her arm in front of 3 people and not one of them had said a word. She watched it all disappear and felt, not relief, not yet. Something more complicated than that. Something that sat in your chest like a stone you'd been carrying so long you'd forgotten it wasn't supposed to be there. The woman across the aisle had fallen asleep against her coat. An older man near the front was reading a newspaper with a penlight. Normal people doing normal things. Eliza watched them and thought about how extraordinary ordinary looked when you hadn't had it in a while. She slept somewhere past the 2nd hour. Not well. She never slept well. But enough. Callaway Creek was smaller than she'd imagined and larger than she'd hoped, which meant it was exactly the kind of town where a stranger arriving on a 6 a.m. bus with 1 bag would be noticed and remembered. She stepped off into a pale morning that smelled like pine sap and wood smoke, and found a diner on the main street that was just unlocking its doors. "Coffee?" the woman behind the counter asked without looking up. "Please." "Passing through or staying?" "Passing through." She hesitated. "I'm meeting someone, a man named Gideon Voss. Do you know him?" The woman, 50s, gray-streaked hair, the look of someone who'd heard most things and been surprised by very few of them, set down the coffee mug and looked at her properly for the first time. "Gideon comes in maybe once a month for supplies," she said. "Quiet man, keeps to himself." She paused in the particular way people pause when they're deciding how much to say. "You the woman from his advertisement?" Eliza wrapped both hands around the mug. "I am." The woman studied her for a moment, not unkindly, but honestly, the way older women sometimes looked at younger ones when they were trying to calculate exactly how much trouble was coming. Then she nodded, apparently reaching some private conclusion. "He's a decent man," she said. "I've never heard a bad word about him. And in a town this size, that's saying something." She turned back to the counter. "He'll be here around 8 to pick up an order he called in yesterday. You've got time to eat something." Eliza ate scrambled eggs she could barely taste and watched the street outside fill slowly with morning. He was taller than she'd expected. That was her first thought, standing up from the diner stool when the bell above the door rang at 8:03 a.m. and a man walked in who could only be Gideon Voss. Tall, broad through the shoulders, wearing a canvas coat that had seen considerable weather, dark hair going gray at the temples. A face that wasn't handsome exactly, but was the kind of face you trusted without being entirely sure why. Something settled in it, unhurried, like a man who had learned not to waste energy on things he couldn't change. He saw her immediately. She saw him register the bag at her feet, the way she'd positioned herself with her back to the wall, and something shifted in his expression. Not pity, which she wouldn't have been able to stand, but a kind of recognition she hadn't expected. He crossed the diner and stopped a respectful distance away and extended his hand. "Miss Rowan." "Mr. Voss." She shook it. His hand was calloused and warm. "I wasn't sure you'd come." "I said I would." He said it simply, without embellishment, and she understood that this was simply how he talked. That with Gideon Voss, a thing said was a thing meant, and there wasn't much more to it than that. He pulled out the chair across from her. "May I?" "Of course." He sat. The diner woman appeared and refilled Eliza's coffee without being asked, and poured a second cup for Gideon without asking him either. Apparently this was an established ritual. "Thank you, Clara," he said. Clara disappeared back behind the counter with the tact of a woman who had seen plenty and knew when not to be present. They sat with their coffee for a moment. Outside, a truck rolled past on the main street. Somewhere in the kitchen, something sizzled on a griddle. "I want to be straightforward with you," Gideon said finally. "I put that advertisement in because I need a partner, and I'm not built for the kind of courtship where a man pretends to be something he isn't. I've tried that. It didn't serve either party well." He paused. "I can't promise you an easy life. The mountain is real, and it doesn't care about anybody's feelings. What I can promise is this: you'll be treated like an equal. Your word in my house counts the same as mine, and whatever you've come from—" He stopped, looked at her steadily. "I'm not asking about it. It's yours to carry or yours to put down, and that's your business." Eliza set her coffee mug down very carefully. She'd prepared for this meeting. She'd rehearsed answers to questions she'd expected him to ask. Where she'd grown up, whether she had family, what kind of work she'd done. She had not prepared for the possibility that he simply wouldn't ask any of it. "That's very—" She stopped, started again. "That's a generous thing to say." "It's not generosity," he said, with the faintest edge of something that might have been humor. "I'm a practical man. Your past doesn't affect whether you can keep a fire going in January." "I can," she said. "I've been keeping things going for a long time." He looked at her, and she had the uncomfortable feeling that he understood considerably more than she'd said. "I know," he said quietly. "I believe you." The justice of the peace in Calloway Creek was a small, dry-voiced man named Harold Fitch. who performed the ceremony in under 4 minutes in his back office, between a filing cabinet and a potted cactus that had seen better decades. There were no flowers. There was no music. Clara from the diner served as witness because Gideon had asked her, and she'd agreed with the particular resignation of a woman who knew she'd end up doing it anyway. "Do you, Gideon Marcus Voss, take this woman?" Eliza stood very straight and kept her hands still at her sides and stared at the cactus on the filing cabinet and thought about exactly nothing, because if she let herself think about anything, she would either cry or run, and she had no intention of doing either. "I do." His voice was level, not romantic, not performative, just true. "Do you, Eliza Ann Rowan, take this man?" She thought about $43. She thought about a bruised jaw and a back staircase in the dark and a bus station that smelled like diesel. She thought about 9 sentences on a piece of paper and the wild, desperate, slightly insane hope that sometimes the plainest offer was the most honest one. "I do," she said. Harold Fitch stamped a paper. Clara signed where indicated. Gideon shook Harold's hand, and that was that. Outside in the cold, Eliza stood on the steps of the Justice of the Peace's office with her one bag and her new name and her new husband, who was looking at the sky with the focused expression of a man reading the weather rather than contemplating his wedding day. "Storm moving in from the northwest," he said. "We should head up before it closes the high road." She looked at him, this tall, quiet, practical stranger she had legally married 37 minutes after meeting him, and felt something she didn't quite have a word for. Not love, not even warmth, not yet, but something solid, something that felt for the first time in a very long while like ground beneath her feet. "Let's go then," she said. The road into the Frostpine Mountains was not a road so much as a strong suggestion made by wagon wheels over many years. Gideon's truck, old, powerful, smelling of dog and pine resin, ground its way up switchbacks that made Eliza grip the door handle without quite meaning to. Through the windshield, the mountains rose ahead of them, enormous and gray and indifferent, their peaks already obscured by the leading edge of the approaching storm. She'd grown up in flatlands. She'd seen hills, but not like this. Not mountains that looked like they were actively hostile to human presence, that wore their ice and their altitude like armor against intrusion. "It's very—" She searched for a word. "Big," he offered. "I was going to say inhospitable." "That too." A pause. "You get used to it. Most things you get used to if you give them time." She wasn't sure if he was talking about the mountains. They drove in silence for a while. The trees thickened on either side, spruce and fir and something she didn't know the name of, all of them enormous and close, the road narrowing until it felt less like they were driving through a forest and more like the forest was tolerating their presence under protest. "How long have you lived up here?" she asked. 8 years? "Alone the whole time?" He was quiet for a moment. For most of it. She didn't push. He had his privacy and she had hers, and they had just promised each other a partnership, not a confession. There would be time for the rest of it, or there wouldn't be, and they'd find some other way to manage. "What should I know?" she said instead. "About the cabin. About how things work up here." He glanced at her briefly, then back at the road. She thought she saw something shift in his expression, approval, maybe, or relief, like a man who'd been braced for a different kind of question entirely. "The woodpile needs to be stacked a certain way, or the top logs slide," he said. "I'll show you. The well is 60 yards east of the cabin. There's a rope on the handle. Don't let it drop. The generator runs on 2 hours of fuel at a stretch, so we conserve it. Weather comes fast up here, and it comes mean. If the sky turns that particular green-gray color in the afternoon, you get inside immediately, and you stay inside." "What color is that exactly?" "You'll know it when you see it." He paused. "And there's a rifle above the door. I assume you know how to use one?" "I know how a gun works," she said carefully. "That's not what I asked." She looked at her hands in her lap. "I've never shot at anything." "I'll teach you." He said it the way he said most things. Not as a favor, just as a fact. "This is what will happen. You need to be able to protect yourself if I'm on the trap line and something comes around the cabin. Bear, mostly. Sometimes mountain lion. They don't usually come close, but they do come. Eliza absorbed this. Bears. Mountain lions. A rifle above the door. $43, she thought again. A bruised jaw. This was what you chose instead. Okay, she said. Okay, he agreed. The cabin appeared around a bend in the track, so suddenly she almost didn't register it at first. She'd been watching the sky, which had gone the color of old iron, the storm visibly closer now, pressing down on the tree line like a hand. Then Gideon slowed the truck, and there it was. It was not what she'd pictured. She wasn't sure what she'd pictured exactly. She supposed some part of her brain had imagined something rustic and charming, the kind of mountain cabin that appeared on calendars and Christmas cards. This was not that cabin. This was a structure that looked like it had been built to survive things, specifically, and had done so repeatedly. The logs were dark and thick. The roof was steeply pitched. There was a covered porch with firewood stacked under it, stacked in a specific way, she now noticed, the way he'd mentioned, and a barn beyond that looked equally practical and equally unglamorous. Everything about it said, this is a place where real things happen. For some reason, that made her feel better than the calendar cabin would have. Gideon pulled up and killed the engine, and they sat for a moment in the sudden silence, which up here was not really silence at all. The wind moved through the spruce trees with a sound like breathing, and somewhere distant there was the creak and pop of settling timber. It's not much to look at, he said, without apology or embarrassment, just an acknowledgement of fact. It's standing, she said, and it's solid. He looked at her. So am I, she added, and she wasn't entirely sure which of them she was reassuring. He got out of the truck. She got out of the truck. The cold hit her immediately. A different cold than Harwick's winter, deeper and drier, with teeth in it. She pulled her coat tighter and looked up at the cabin and the dark spruce forest pressing in on three sides and the storm boiling in overhead, and she held all of it in her mind at once, all of the terror and the uncertainty and the strange, trembling, barely there thing that might eventually become hope. She thought about her brother's house. She thought about the creak of that third step in the dark. She picked up her bag. She walked toward the cabin door. Inside, the fire had burned low, but not out. Gideon coaxed it back while she stood in the center of the main room and took inventory, not like someone seeing a new home, but like someone checking for exits. Old habit. She caught herself doing it and made herself stop. The room was spare and clean in the way that said a solitary person had lived here long enough to eliminate everything unnecessary. A table, 2 chairs, shelves of canned goods and equipment organized with military precision, the rifle above the door exactly where he'd said, and a second chair. She wasn't sure why that detail hit her the way it did. He'd been alone for 8 years, he'd said, but there were 2 chairs at that table, like some part of him had always been waiting. She set her bag down next to the one on the left. Outside, the storm broke over the mountain with a sound like the world clearing its throat. Eliza Voss stood in the firelight and breathed. The first morning she woke up in the cabin, Eliza didn't know where she was. That happened sometimes. Had been happening for years, actually. That moment between sleep and waking where your brain hadn't caught up to your body yet, and you were just a person in a dark room trying to remember if you were safe. She lay completely still the way she'd taught herself to do, listening before moving. Old reflex. The kind you develop when waking up wrong has consequences. What she heard was wind, deep, sustained, the kind that didn't gust so much as press. A constant weight against the cabin walls that made the timber creak in low, almost musical intervals. She heard the pop and settle of a fire that had been recently fed. She heard, from somewhere outside and muffled by distance and storm, the sound of an axe splitting wood in a steady, unhurried rhythm. She remembered where she was. She lay there another moment, staring at the low ceiling where the firelight moved in orange shapes, and conducted a quiet internal inventory. She was warm. She was alone in the room. The door was solid and the windows were small, and the rifle was above the front door exactly where he'd said it would be. These were the facts. She gathered them around herself like a coat and sat up. The storm from the night before had not passed. Through the window above the dry sink she could see nothing but white Not a gentle snowfall, but the particular aggressive white of a mountain blizzard that had committed fully to its purpose. The spruce trees nearest the cabin were barely visible, reduced to dark shapes at the edge of the gray nothing beyond. She built the fire up higher than it needed to be because she could, because there was a full woodpile right outside the door, and nobody was going to tell her to leave it alone and not waste it. And that small, stupid act of feeding a fire without asking permission made something loosen slightly in her chest. She found coffee in a tin on the shelf, exactly where you'd expect a practical man to keep it, and put water on to boil, and was standing at the window watching the blizzard erase the world when the front door opened and Gideon came in on a gust of frozen air, stamping snow from his boots with the mechanical efficiency of a man who did this every day without thinking about it. He stopped when he saw her at the stove. "You're up," he said, like he might have been expecting to find her still in bed at... She looked at the clock above the shelf. 6:47 in the morning. "I'm always up early," she said. "Coffee's almost ready." He hung his coat on the hook by the door and sat at the table and pulled off his boots, and she poured 2 cups and brought them over, and they sat across from each other at that table with its 2 chairs and drank their coffee while the storm threw itself against the cabin walls. And nobody said anything for a few minutes, and it wasn't uncomfortable. That surprised her. She was used to silence that had weight in it, silence that meant someone was angry or calculating or waiting for the right moment to say something that would land like a slap. This silence was different. It was just 2 people drinking coffee in the morning because there wasn't anything urgent that needed saying yet. "Storm will hold another day, maybe 2, Gideon said finally, wrapping both hands around his mug. "Trapline's going to have to wait. There's work here, though, if you want it." "I want it," she said immediately, and something in her own voice surprised her. The quickness of it, the certainty. She hadn't realized until she heard herself say it how much she did not want to sit still with nothing to do but think. He looked at her over the rim of his cup. "You don't have to prove anything," he said. "Not to me." "I know," she said. "I want the work anyway." He nodded, accepted it, didn't make it into something it wasn't. That was the first morning. The days that followed had a shape to them, which was something she hadn't had in a long time. Or rather, she'd had a shape, but it had been imposed from the outside, bent to someone else's schedule and moods and needs. This shape was different. It was built out of necessity rather than control, and there was a significant difference between the two that she felt in her body before she could articulate it in her head. Gideon was up before light. She started getting up with him. Not because he asked her to, but because she found that the pre-dawn hours in the cabin, when the fire was fresh and the coffee was hot and the mountain outside was still dark and quiet, had a particular quality of peace that she wanted to be awake for. He never commented on it. He simply set 2 cups out instead of 1. He showed her the woodpile first, specifically the way the top logs were stacked at an angle to shed meltwater, which she'd already figured out from looking at it, but she didn't say that and just let him show her. He showed her the well, the rope, the importance of never letting the handle drop because the bucket had gone down twice, and retrieving it was a half-day misery. He showed her the barn where he kept 2 horses, a sturdy gray mare named Pocket, for reasons he didn't explain and she didn't ask, and a younger bay gelding he called Nothing, apparently, or at least nothing he'd share. "Does the bay have a name?" she asked, offering her hand flat for the horse to sniff at. "He came with one I didn't like," Gideon said from behind her. "I've been meaning to give him another." "What was the one you didn't like?" A pause. "Prince?" She almost smiled. "I can see why that wouldn't suit." "He's not a prince of anything," Gideon said, with a tone that suggested this was a matter of some importance. "He's a working animal." It seemed dishonest. She did smile then, turned away so he wouldn't see it, ran her hand along the gelding's nose. "What about something plain then? Something honest?" "Like what?" She thought about it. "Steady," she said. "He stood still the whole time you were talking. Most horses don't." There was a silence behind her that went on long enough that she turned around, mildly worried she'd overstepped somehow. Gideon was looking at the bay horse with the expression of a man reconsidering something. "Steady," he repeated. "You don't have to—" "No," he said. "That's a good name." He reached past her and put his hand briefly on the horse's neck. "Steady it is." It was such a small thing, the naming of a horse, But Eliza held on to it as she went to sleep that night, held it carefully like something fragile she wasn't sure she trusted not to break. The storm broke on the third day and Gideon went out to run the trap line, which covered 15 miles of mountain terrain in a rough loop that took him the better part of 2 days. He left before dawn, told her he'd be back by nightfall the following day, and gave her a list of what needed doing around the cabin and barn in a tone that was informational rather than instructional. Here is what needs doing, not here is what you will do. She did all of it, and then some. She found a bag of rice in the back of the pantry shelf that had gone stale and threw it out. She organized the canned goods by type rather than by the apparently random system they'd been occupying before. She found a split in the porch step that she packed with wood filler she located in the barn, imperfectly, with the results looking exactly like what they were. A first attempt by someone who didn't entirely know what they were doing, but solid enough to hold. She fed Pocket and Steady and mucked out the barn and stacked the delivered firewood that had been sitting outside the barn door since before she arrived. She was doing this last task when she found the photograph. It had blown out from somewhere, from behind the stacked wood maybe, or fallen from a shelf in the barn, and it was lying face up in the snow just at the edge of the drift. A small photo, the old kind, slightly water damaged at one corner. A woman and a man, younger versions both, standing in front of what might have been this cabin in summer. The woman was laughing at something off camera. The man was looking at her instead of at whatever she was laughing at. The man was Gideon. She recognized the set of his shoulders, even 20 years younger. She looked at the photograph for a moment, then set it on the shelf inside the barn door where it would stay dry, weighed down with a stone. She didn't examine it further. Everyone was allowed their private history. He came back the following evening as promised. She heard Steady's hoofbeats on the frozen track before she saw them. And she had food on the stove, not because she thought that was her role, but because she'd been hungry and had made more than she could eat. He came in looking tired and cold, in the deep physical way of a man who'd been outside in hard weather for 36 hours, and he sat at the table and ate 2 bowls of the elk stew she'd made from meat in the cold pantry without saying much. After a while, he said, "You did the porch step." "It's rough," she said. "I wasn't sure what I was doing." "It'll hold," he said. "Better than before." A pause. "You organized the canned goods. I can put them back how they were." "No," he said. "Your way makes more sense." She poured more coffee. Outside, the mountain was quiet, just the wind moving through the trees, a sound she was already starting to feel as normal rather than alien. 15 days in, and her nervous system was beginning, slowly and reluctantly, to stand down from its permanent state of alert. Not all the way, not even close, but incrementally, degree by degree. "There was a photograph," she said carefully, not looking at him. "In the barn. It blew out from somewhere. I put it on the shelf by the door." A silence. "I didn't look at it for long," she added. "I just moved it inside so it wouldn't get wet." "Thank you," he said quietly. She didn't ask. He didn't offer. The topic closed the way a door closes, not slammed, just shut, and the shape of what was behind it remained private. But later she thought about the way the man in that photograph had looked at the woman. Like she was the most interesting thing in the room. Like whatever she was laughing at was secondary to the fact of her laughing. She thought about what it meant that Gideon Voss had placed an advertisement in 3 different regional papers looking for a partner and a practical arrangement and an honest exchange of labor and company. She thought about whether a man who looked at a woman like that had been trying to replace something or trying to build something entirely different, and she decided, after a while, that it wasn't her business to figure out which. The rifle lesson happened on a clear day in the 3rd week when the temperature lifted enough to feel almost generous and the light on the snow was sharp and white. "We'll start with stance," Gideon said, handing her the rifle with the matter-of-fact air of a man handing over a tool, which was more or less what he believed it was. "Everything else is secondary. Your feet first." "Shoulder width apart," she said. He looked at her. "I've seen it done," she said. "I just haven't done it." "Knowing and doing are different things." "Yes," she said. "I'm aware of that." He positioned her, hands on her shoulders to adjust her angle, brief and impersonal, stepping away again immediately. and she noticed that he always moved like that around her, always with the particular care of a man who understood that proximity and contact were things you earned rather than assumed. She hadn't had to tell him that. He'd simply known it or had figured it out from the way she still sometimes flinched at movement she didn't see coming and had adjusted his own behavior accordingly without comment or ceremony. The first shot went wide by a significant margin, and she said a word she didn't usually say out loud. "Again," Gideon said without reaction. The second shot was better. Not good, but better. There was a difference. "Don't pull the trigger," he said. "Press it, like you're pushing a button slowly. You're not trying to make it fire, you're just removing the resistance." She tried it. The third shot hit the outer edge of the target, a piece of bark he'd propped against a spruce at 40 feet. "There," he said. "That barely counted." "It counted," he said. "You hit what you were aiming at. That's what counted means." She lowered the rifle and turned to look at him, squinting against the snow-bright light. "You're patient," she said. "You don't get frustrated." He seemed to consider this like it was a genuinely novel observation. "Getting frustrated doesn't make you a better teacher," he said. "It just makes you louder." She thought about every person who had ever tried to teach her anything, or claimed to. Every lesson that had come attached to impatience, to sighing, to the particular cruelty of someone demonstrating that your inability to learn fast enough was a personal failing, they were graciously enduring. "No," she said. "I suppose it doesn't." She shot until her shoulder ached. He didn't tell her to stop. She stopped when she was ready. The hard days were harder than she'd expected, and she'd expected them to be hard. There was a week in the 6th week. Deep in February, the cold settled into the mountain like it intended to stay permanently. When everything went wrong in the particular compounding way that reminded you, life was not interested in distributing its difficulties fairly. The generator failed. The oldest of the hens died for reasons neither of them could identify. There was a problem with the well rope that took Gideon most of a day to fix, while she maintained the fire and tried to keep the water from freezing in the pipes, stuffing insulating material into gaps with her bare hands because they'd run out of proper weather stripping and her gloves were wet. That evening she was tired in a way that went past her muscles and into something more fundamental. The kind of tired where you stop having the energy to manage what you're feeling and things leak through that you'd normally keep contained. She was sitting on the floor in front of the fire. The chair had seemed like too much effort, with her head back against the seat and her eyes closed, and she didn't hear Gideon come in, didn't hear him assess the room and the state of her. And so when he set a cup of tea on the floor beside her hand, she startled badly, a full-body flinch that knocked the cup sideways and sent hot tea across the floorboards. She was on her feet before she'd finished waking up, hands up, already backing. "It's me," Gideon said, immediately, quietly, not moving. "It's just me. I'm sorry. I should have made more noise." She stood with her back against the wall, and her heart hammering in a way that had nothing to do with him and everything to do with years of other rooms and other moments and other sounds in the dark. And she knew this, and he could probably see this, and she hated it with a ferocity that surprised even her. "I'm sorry," she said through her teeth. "Don't apologize," he said. "You didn't do anything wrong. I spilled the tea." "There's more tea," he said. "Sit down. Please." She slid back down to the floor. He cleaned up the tea without being asked and made another cup and set it beside her more carefully this time, putting it down where she could see it first. And then he sat in the chair above her, and they were quiet for a while. "I'm not going to ask," he said finally, "because I said I wouldn't, and I meant it. But I want you to know." He stopped, started again like he was choosing the words from a limited supply and didn't want to waste them. "Whatever happened to you, it wasn't your fault, and it's not going to happen here." She stared at the fire. "You don't know what happened," she said. "No," he agreed. "I don't. But I know what it looks like when someone's been surviving instead of living, and I know the difference doesn't fix itself overnight." He paused. "I'm not in a hurry." The fire crackled. Somewhere outside, the mountain wind was doing what it always did, pressing and breathing and pressing again. "My brother," she said, and stopped. The words sat between them. She didn't say anything else. He didn't ask her to. But something had shifted in the room. Some small pressure had been released, the way the air changes when a window opens somewhere in a closed house, and you feel the difference before you can identify the source. "Okay," Gideon said. "Just that." "Okay," she said. He stayed in the chair until she fell asleep, which she didn't realize until she woke up hours later and found a blanket over her that she hadn't put there herself. He was gone to bed, the cabin quiet, the fire banked down to coals. The cup of tea was still beside her, long cold. She sat there in the dark and breathed the cold, clean air that even inside the cabin smelled like pine and snow, and she thought, this is a different kind of man. Not perfect, not easy, not warm in the obvious ways that announce themselves and ask to be noticed, but steady, like the horse. She learned the trap line the way she learned everything in those months, by doing it, badly first, and then less badly, and then adequately, and then one morning she came in from a solo run through the lower loop, the section Gideon had started sending her on alone in the 7th week, and she'd reset 4 traps correctly and cleared a 5th that had a spruce branch across it and navigated back to the cabin in a light snowfall without getting turned around even once. And she stood in the doorway still breathing hard from the cold and felt something so unfamiliar it took her a moment to identify it. Pride. Just straightforward, uncomplicated pride in a thing done right. She couldn't remember the last time she'd felt that. Gideon was at the table sharpening a blade, and he looked up when she came in and looked at her face, and she knew he could read whatever was on it, because he'd gotten good at reading her, or maybe he'd always been good at reading people, and had just been waiting for her to be readable. "All 4 in the lower loop," he said. "And cleared the 5th, she said. "Branch had come down across the trigger." He nodded. "Good catch." "I got turned around for a minute near the creek bend," she admitted, because she'd decided early on that she wasn't going to perform competence she didn't have. "I sorted it out, but it took me a few minutes." "That bend turns everyone around the first dozen times," he said. "Even me, 8 years ago." She hung up her coat and her gear and washed her hands at the basin and looked out the window at the mountain. At the Frostpine Range that 2 months ago had looked like a hostile foreign territory and now looked like, if not home exactly, then at least a place that knew she was here and had chosen to allow it. "Gideon," she said. Thank you." She turned around. "For the way you—" She made a gesture that was supposed to encompass the rifle and the trap line and the tea on the floor and the blanket she hadn't asked for and the 2 chairs and 8 years of solitude and 1 advertisement placed in 3 regional papers. All of it. He looked at her for a moment with that still expression she'd stopped finding unreadable and had started finding, somewhere along the way, something close to comforting. "You did the work," he said. "I just didn't get in the way of it." She turned back to the window. Outside, the afternoon light was moving through the spruce trees at a low angle, catching the snow in a way that made the whole mountain look briefly, improbably beautiful. Not the cruel beauty of the blizzard, but something quieter, something that you could stand inside without being destroyed by it. She was still afraid sometimes. She still flinched at sounds. She still woke up in the dark not knowing where she was, still needed a moment to find herself in the silence. But she was learning the mountain. And the mountain, in its impassive, unsentimental way, was learning her back. She didn't know yet what was coming. She didn't know that the thing she'd run from wasn't finished with her. She didn't know that the mountains she'd come to for shelter would become, before the winter was done, the stage for the most important moment of her life. What she knew was this: the woman who had stood at a bus station with $43 and a bruised jaw was not quite the woman standing here now. That woman had been surviving. This woman was beginning, just barely, to do something else. She wasn't sure yet what to call it, but it felt, in the low afternoon light, like the first real thing she'd felt in years. The signs were there before she knew how to read them. Looking back later, and she would look back many times, turning the sequence of events over in her mind the way you turn a stone and find something unpleasant underneath. She could identify the exact moment the mountain started warning her. She just hadn't known yet that the mountain did that it spoke in a language of particular silences and animal behaviors and pressure changes in the air that Gideon had been fluent in for years, and she was only beginning to understand. It was the birds first, the Steller's jays that had become a reliable fixture of the mornings, loud and territorial and utterly indifferent to human presence, were gone 3 days before it happened. She noticed their absence without registering its significance. The way you notice a clock has stopped only after the silence has already settled around you. The ravens were gone too. Even Pocket shifted in her stall at night with a restlessness that had nothing to do with feed or weather. The second sign was the sky, not the green-gray that Gideon had described in the truck on that first drive up, the color that meant get inside immediately, but something subtler, a flatness to the light in the afternoons, a particular quality of stillness in the hour before dark that felt less like peace and more like held breath. She mentioned it to Gideon one evening while they were eating. "The light's been strange," she said. He looked up from his plate. "Strange how?" "Flat," she said, "like the sun's working harder than usual and not getting anywhere." He was quiet for a moment. "Storm coming?" he said. "Big one, maybe? Bigger than the ones we've had?" He picked up his fork again. "Probably." She took that to mean yes. That was 4 days before Silas came. The things she'd allowed herself to believe, in those months on the mountain, the comfortable, necessary fiction she'd constructed to make it possible to sleep and work and begin the slow process of becoming something other than afraid, was that distance was the same as safety. That 11 miles of switchback road and 2 days of hard travel in a mountain range that ate people who underestimated it was the same as being truly beyond reach. She'd known, on some level she didn't examine, that it wasn't. But knowing something underneath the surface and letting it live on the surface where you have to look at it every day are different things, and she'd chosen, deliberately, not to examine it. You had to, sometimes. You had to choose which fears you were going to carry to bed with you and which ones you left outside the door, because if you carried all of them, you'd never sleep at all. So she hadn't thought about Silas, or rather, she'd thought about him the way you think about a tooth that might need a root canal. Briefly, with avoidance, and then firmly moved on. She was in the barn when it happened. The morning had been ordinary. Gideon had left before light to check the upper trap line. A long run, 12 miles, that would take him through the day and bring him back before dark if conditions held. She'd done the morning routine alone, which by now was simply routine, no longer unfamiliar. The fire, the coffee, the horses, the chickens, the morning survey of the woodpile and the well. She'd split a cord of wood that needed doing and stacked it under the porch roof, and her arms ached pleasantly the way they did now after real work, and she'd gone to the barn to check on Pocket because the mare had been off her feed for 2 days and she was monitoring it. She was standing in Pocket's stall, one hand on the horse's neck, not thinking about anything much, when she heard it. A vehicle on the track. She didn't move for a moment. Vehicles on the track were not common, but they weren't unheard of. There was a hunting party that came through twice a year, and the man 11 miles east occasionally drove up to trade or borrow equipment. She stood very still and listened to the engine sound, and something happened in her body that preceded any conscious thought. A coldness in her hands, a specific tightening across her shoulders that had a particular name she knew very well. The engine stopped. A door opened. Footsteps on the frozen ground. The particular heavy tread of a large man who wasn't concerned about being heard. Pocket shifted under her hand. "Eliza!" The voice came through the barn wall like it had no business being there, like it had traveled 200 miles and 11 switchbacks, just to find her here in a horse stall with sawdust on her boots, and her whole body went sideways in a way that had nothing to do with her feet because her feet had gone completely numb. Silas. She knew she should move. She understood cognitively that standing in a horse stall was not the best position from which to handle whatever was about to happen. But there was a specific quality to her brother's voice, a frequency she'd been hearing since childhood, one that had been associated for so long with the anticipation of something bad that her nervous system responded to it like a switch being thrown. And the switch that got thrown was the one that had kept her alive for years, the one that said, "Don't move, assess, wait." She breathed. Once. Twice. "I know you're in there," Silas said. "Your truck's here. Smoke's up. I've been watching the place for 10 minutes. She put her hand on the barn door and pushed it open and stepped out into the cold gray morning and looked at her brother for the first time in 4 months. He was bigger than she remembered, or maybe it was just that she'd stopped unconsciously adjusting for his size the way people do when they live with large, dangerous things for long enough that the size becomes background. He was standing 15 feet from the barn in a coat that wasn't suited for mountain cold. He'd underestimated the weather, which meant he'd underestimated the trip, which meant he'd come up in a hurry and hadn't planned this as carefully as he would have liked. She filed that away. His face was the same. That was the thing that hit her hardest, stupidly. She wasn't sure what she'd expected, some physical change that reflected the months and the distance, but he looked exactly like himself. Square jaw, pale eyes that had a flat quality, not cold exactly, but uninvested, like a camera rather than a person. He'd always had eyes like that. She used to wonder if he'd been born with them or had arrived at them through practice. "There you are," he said, and the tone was conversational, almost affectionate, the tone of a man who'd been looking for something he owned. Had to ask around Calloway Creek. Not hard. Everybody knows everybody up here, apparently. Helpful people. "Silas," she said. Her voice came out even. She was surprised by that. "You look different," he said, looking at her in that assessing way he had. Thinner, harder. He said it like these were criticisms. "This what you ran off for, playing mountain woman?" "I didn't run off," she said. "I left." Something moved behind his eyes. "Come on now, get your things and we'll go before that weather closes in. I drove 2 days to get here. I'm not in the mood for... I'm not going with you." The words landed in the cold air between them and stayed there. She watched his face do the thing it did when he was recalibrating. A slight tightening around the jaw, a flicker of something behind the flat eyes. She'd spent years watching for that flicker, reading it the way Gideon had taught her to read the sky. "You're married to some trapper," he said. "I heard. That's not a marriage, Eliza. That's a transaction. You don't even know this man." "I know him better than I ever knew you," she said. His jaw tightened further. "You're going to stand there and... Where is he?" The voice came from behind her and to the left. Silas's eyes moved past her shoulder, and something happened to his posture, a very slight adjustment, the kind you make when the situation changes dimensions you hadn't accounted for. She turned. Gideon was at the corner of the cabin. He must have come down the back trail from the upper line, must have heard the engine or seen the strange truck from above and come down instead of continuing. He was still in his trail gear, rifle slung across his back, and he was not pointing it at anyone, not threatening anything, just standing there with his hands loose at his sides, looking at Silas Rowan with the particular quality of attention he gave to things that required assessment. "You're the trapper," Silas said. "I am," Gideon said. He looked at Eliza. "You all right?" "Yes," she said. He nodded once and walked to stand beside her, not in front of her, not positioning himself between her and her brother in the way that would have communicated that she needed protecting. Beside her, even with her. It was a specific choice, and she recognized it as one. Silas looked at both of them, his mouth pulled at one corner in a way she knew. "This is what it is, then. You think you can just... what, disappear into the mountains? Start over? Eliza, you have a life. You have family." "I have a husband," she said, "and a home. A cabin in the..." He stopped, started again, and when he started again, his voice had shifted into a register she knew even better, the lower one, the one that didn't need to raise itself because it had always found other ways to be loud. "You think I'm going to drive 2 days back down this mountain and explain to everyone that my sister ran off with... But, yes," she said, "that's exactly what you're going to do." The silence that followed had a specific texture. She'd spoken over him. She'd cut off that particular sentence in that particular voice, the voice that had always meant the end of the conversation, the beginning of what came after. And she'd done it not with anger, not with the shaking, adrenaline-soaked defiance she might have expected from herself. She'd done it clearly, like someone identifying a fact. Silas stared at her. She stared back. This was the thing she hadn't known about herself until right now. Standing in the frozen yard of a mountain cabin in a coat she'd owned for 4 months, with split wood calluses on her hands and a rifle she now knew how to use hanging inside the cabin door, she wasn't afraid of his eyes anymore. She was looking at them directly, and the thing that had always lived behind them, the threat, the weight, the implied consequence, was still there, but it had stopped being bigger than her. She wasn't sure exactly when that had happened. Somewhere in the months of work and silence and small dignities accumulated like stones in a wall, one at a time, not dramatic, not noticed until you stepped back and saw the whole structure. "Who do you think you're talking to?" Silas said. "You," she said. "I know exactly who I'm talking to." He took a step forward, not a large step. He was too controlled for that, too practiced at the specific calibration of implied threat. But a step. Gideon moved, not in front of her. He shifted fractionally, weight redistributed, and his right hand dropped to his side in a way that was quiet and unhurried and communicated something very specific about his position on what was happening. Silas stopped. He was not a stupid man. She'd always known that about him. It was part of what made him effective, that he was intelligent enough to read rooms and people and situations, that the control he exercised had always been precise rather than blunt. He read the situation now. He read Gideon, standing there in the cold with the stillness of a man who had been alone in the mountains for 8 years and had genuinely stopped being worried about very many things. He read Eliza, who had stopped flinching. "This is embarrassing," Silas said. Not to her, to the air, to the mountain, to some audience he appeared to be performing for even when alone. "You've embarrassed yourself. You've embarrassed the family." "There isn't a family," she said. "There was you and there was me, and what that was, it wasn't family." His face went through something she hadn't seen before. A crack in the camera lens quality of those eyes, something moving underneath that she might, if she were generous, have read as hurt, but which she suspected was something closer to the specific wound of a man realizing the leverage he's carried for years has stopped working. "You really aren't coming," he said. "No," she said. "I'm really not." The wind moved through the spruce trees with its low, constant voice. Somewhere in the barn, Pocket shifted in her stall. The sky above them was pressing down with the weight of the coming storm, that flat gray that had been building for days, and flakes were starting. Not many yet, just the advance scouts of what was coming. Silas stood in the middle of that yard and looked at her for a long moment, and she stood and let him look, because she had nothing left to hide from him, and that was the truth of the whole thing. You couldn't threaten someone who had already survived the thing you were threatening them with. She had lost everything she was supposed to be afraid of losing, had stood at a bus station with $43 and walked deliberately into the worst possible version of the fear, and what she'd found on the other side of it was not what she'd expected. Not happiness, not yet, not the easy kind, but something sturdier than happiness, something closer to ground. "You'll regret this," he said. The words were meant to land somewhere and stick. She felt them land and felt them slide off. "Maybe," she said. "It'll be mine to regret." He looked at Gideon one more time. Gideon looked back at him with the serene, implacable expression of a man who had nothing to prove and nowhere else to be, and had already made peace with every possible version of the next 5 minutes. There was nothing for Silas to grab onto in that expression. No fear, no provocation, no performance of toughness that could be punctured or matched. Just a man standing in his own yard next to his own wife in the beginning of a snowstorm, waiting for a visitor to finish his visit. Silas turned and walked back to his truck. She watched him go. She noticed that his shoulders were set wrong, the tight-held set of a man fighting the urge to turn around, to have the last word, to reclaim something that was slipping through his hands on the frozen ground of a mountain he'd never be able to call his. He got in the truck. The engine turned over. She didn't move. Her feet were cold. She realized distantly that she'd come out of the barn without her heavy gloves, and her hands were going numb, but she stood in the yard and watched the truck back down the track, watched it disappear around the first bend, and kept watching the space where it had been for a moment longer, even after it was gone. The snow was coming harder now, large flakes, unhurried, settling into the shapes of things and changing them. Gideon stood beside her. Neither of them said anything for a moment. Then she let out a breath that had apparently been inside her for a very long time, because it went on longer than a single breath should go. And when it was done, her legs felt strange, not weak exactly, but emptied out, like a container that had been holding too much pressure and had finally been allowed to equalize. He'll be off the high road before the storm closes it, Gideon said quietly. Practical. Information, not comfort, which was somehow better than comfort would have been. I know, she said. She looked down at her hands. They were shaking. Not from cold, or not only from cold. That's normal, Gideon said, looking at them too. I know that too, she said. Doesn't make it easier to watch. No, he agreed. It doesn't. She curled her numb fingers and uncurled them. The snow was settling on her shoulders, on her hair, on the split wood stacked under the porch roof. The mountain was going white again, doing what it did, covering things and changing their shapes and making everything quiet. He looked smaller, she said. Then I remembered. Gideon was quiet for a moment. Fear makes things bigger, he said. That's its whole job. She thought about that. She thought about the 11 miles of switchback road and the flat-eyed man who had driven 2 days to find her, and the fact that she was still standing in this yard, feet on this ground, and he was the one who had turned around and left. She'd spent years thinking about the day she might face him again. In her worst moments, lying awake in the dark cabin while the wind pressed against the walls, she'd imagined a dozen versions of it, and most of them had ended the way everything had always ended with Silas, with her smaller and him larger and the space between them arranged to his advantage. Not one of the versions she'd imagined had looked like this. Her, standing, him, leaving. She'd imagined being rescued. She'd never thought to imagine simply not needing to be. Come inside, Gideon said. You're not wearing your gloves. I know, she said. I noticed. But she stayed one more moment in the yard, in the snow, looking at the place where her brother's truck had been. The mountain didn't care that any of this had happened. The snow was coming down the same way it would have come down regardless, covering the tire tracks in the lane, smoothing over the place where a man had stood and tried to take something that didn't belong to him anymore. In another hour, you wouldn't be able to see that anyone had been here at all. That felt right to her. That felt correct. She went inside. Gideon put water on while she stood at the fire and held her hands out to it, watching the feeling come back into her fingers with the particular unpleasant tingling of returning circulation. She was still shaking slightly, though it was already lessening, her body processing what her mind was still working through. He won't come back, she said. Not a question. No, Gideon said. He won't. How do you know? He set the kettle on the hook over the fire and looked at her. Because men like that, the kind that run on control, when the control stops working, they don't waste more effort. They find easier ground. He said it without particular emotion, just observation, like describing animal behavior in the wild, which she supposed it was in a way. You stopped being easier ground. She looked at her hands. The shaking had almost stopped. I was scared, she said. I want to be clear about that. I was terrified. I know, he said. I didn't feel it until now, she said. While it was happening, I didn't feel it. That's how it works sometimes, he said. The fear waits until you don't need it anymore, and then it comes in and presents the bill. She almost laughed. Not quite, but almost. That's a grim way to put it. It's accurate, he said, and there it was, the faintest edge of something in his voice, the almost humor she'd learned to hear under the flat practicality. She'd come to depend on it in a way she hadn't expected, the tiny signals that said there was more than function underneath the surface of this man, that the quiet was chosen rather than empty. The water heated. She drank tea and he drank coffee, and the storm settled in around the cabin with the serious, committed quality of a storm that had waited long enough and was now getting down to business. The wind picked up as the afternoon went gray, throwing snow against the windows in bursts, finding the gaps in the porch boards and whistling through them. Inside, the fire held. She sat at the table and thought about her brother driving back down the mountain in this weather. She checked herself for guilt and found something complicated that wasn't quite guilt and wasn't quite its absence. It was something more like an overdue accounting, a debt that had been structured wrong for a long time, in somebody else's favor, being corrected. She thought about what Gideon had said. Fear makes things bigger. 26 years it had made Silas enormous, had made the space around him collapse inward. had made every room he was in feel smaller and every exit seem further away. She had organized her entire interior life around the size of him and the direction of his attention, and standing in the yard today, she had discovered that he was just a man. Not small. She wouldn't overstate it. He would always be someone she needed to take seriously. But finite, measurable, not bigger than the ground she was standing on. "Gideon," she said. He looked up from the trap he was when the outdoor work was done. "I need you to know something," she said. He set the trap down and gave her the particular quality of attention he gave to things he considered worth attending to. "What you did today," she said. "Standing there like that. Not stepping in front of me." She paused, finding the words. "I need you to know that was the right thing, that it mattered. Not because it worked, but because you understood what I needed without me having to explain it." He looked at her for a moment. "I figured you'd let me know if you needed something different." "Most people don't do that," she said. "Most people step in front. Most people think they're helping," he said simply. He picked up the trap again. "You didn't need help. You needed somebody standing beside you." She looked at him, this quiet, difficult, decent man with his calloused hands and his 2 chairs and his horse with the honest name, and felt something she'd been feeling for weeks without letting herself name it, because naming things made them real and real things could be lost. She let herself name it. Outside, the storm had committed fully to its work. The world outside the cabin windows was white and invisible, and the temperature was dropping with the dedicated efficiency of a frostpine winter that had decided it wasn't finished yet. They were sealed in. They were going to be sealed in for days, most likely. She found that she didn't mind. She found, actually, that sealed in with this man in this cabin, in this storm, felt more like safety than anything else she could think of. And the last time she'd thought of sealed in as safety, she'd been very small and the world had been very different. The fire burned, the wind howled. The storm sealed them inside the mountain like it was keeping a secret. And Eliza Voss sat at her kitchen table in the life she had built from $43 and a 9-sentence letter. And for the first time in as long as she could remember, she was not waiting for something bad to happen. The storm lasted 4 days. Not the dramatic, cinematic kind of 4 days, where each morning brought some new crisis to overcome and each night ended with hard-won resolution. Just 4 days of actual winter sealed into an actual mountain cabin with another actual person, which turned out to be its own kind of test, quieter than the confrontation in the yard, less obviously dramatic, but in some ways more revealing. The second day of the storm, she burned breakfast. Not slightly. Catastrophically, the kind of burned where the pan itself seemed to be reconsidering its life choices. She'd been distracted, staring at the window at the white wall of snow outside and thinking about Silas on the road, about whether he'd made it down before the high road closed and the eggs went from cooking to cremated in the time it took her mind to come back to the room. She stood at the stove looking at the pan. Gideon appeared in the doorway from the back room where he'd been working on equipment. He looked at the pan. He looked at her. He went to the shelf and got down the tin of oats without saying a word, and she moved aside and he made oatmeal, and they ate it at the table and neither of them mentioned the eggs. That was the second day. The third day they played cards. She didn't know he had cards until she found the battered deck in a drawer while looking for a pencil, and she held them up and he looked at them like a man who had forgotten something he'd once owned. "Do you play?" she asked. "I used to." Used to meaning you forgot how, or used to meaning you stopped? He considered this distinction with more seriousness than it probably deserved. "Stopped," he said finally. "There wasn't anyone to play with." "There is now," she said. "They played rummy for 3 hours. He was better than her." She was competitive in a way she hadn't known about herself until she found herself paying very close attention to his face for tells, which he didn't have or didn't show. His expression during cards was the same as his expression during everything else, which was the expression of a man present in the room without particularly advertising the fact. "You're not going to give me anything, are you?" she said during the fourth hand. "Give you what?" "A tell, something, a twitch, anything." "I don't have tells," he said, and drew a card. "Everyone has tells. I've been told that before." He laid down 3 queens with the serenity of a man who had been holding them for 6 draws and waiting. "I've been told I'm hard to read." "You are hard to read," she said, looking at his cards and then at her own losing hand with a resignation she was trying to make look like dignity. Has anyone ever told you that's frustrating? Yes, he said. Several people. Did it bother you? He thought about it. Not particularly. I'd rather be hard to read than easy to predict. She put her cards down. Outside, the wind threw a particular heavy gust against the cabin that rattled the windows in their frames and then subsided. She'd stopped startling at those gusts sometime in the second month. Progress. Easy to predict, she said. Is that what you thought I was? When you placed the advertisement? He shuffled the cards slowly. I didn't think about you at all, he said, before you wrote back. And after? He dealt the next hand. I thought you sounded careful, he said. Your letters, like someone who chose every word before they put it down. I did, she said. I wasn't sure what you were. That's sensible, he said. I could have been anyone. You could have been terrible. I could have, he agreed, with the complete lack of offense of a man who understood the reasonableness of the concern. You took a risk. I was already in a dangerous situation, she said, picking up her hand and arranging it without thinking. I just decided which risk I'd rather take. He looked at her over his cards. And you're not terrible, she said. As it turns out, something moved at the edge of his expression. Not a smile, not quite, but the shape of one. The ghost of one, maybe. The way a door has a shape even when it's closed. Encouraging, he said. She looked at her cards. She had a good hand this time, better than she'd had all afternoon. She thought about whether to show it and decided to hold it back a few turns, let him think she was losing again. She was learning to be strategic about what she revealed. That was new. Or rather, it was old, but the old version had been armor, had been hiding things for survival. This was different. This was choosing what to keep and what to share, not out of fear, but out of something more like playfulness. And playfulness was a thing she hadn't known she had access to anymore. She won the hand. You were holding that, Gideon said, looking at her cards with the first expression she could identify as genuine surprise. I was, she said. He looked at her, and this time the almost smile made it all the way. Brief, small, over in a second. But there. Good, he said. She gathered the cards to deal the next hand and held that small moment carefully, the way she'd learned to hold the small moments, because she'd learned that they were what everything else was made of. The storm broke on the morning of the 5th day. She knew it before she looked outside. The quality of the silence changed, the particular absence of wind pressure against the walls, and she lay in bed for a moment identifying the difference before she got up. The sky outside the window was a color she'd learned to love in these months, the specific deep blue that followed frostpine storms, as though the mountain were compensating for what it had just put you through. The aftermath of a storm was its own kind of work. They spent 2 full days digging out, clearing the porch and the path to the barn and the track out to the main road, checking the roof for ice buildup, checking the animals, checking the fences and the equipment, and the 100 small things that a storm of that size put at risk. She did it alongside him without being assigned to it, which had become the natural order of things. She saw what needed doing, and she did it, and he did the same, and the work got done. On the 2nd day of clearing, she found the hole in the barn roof. A split seam in the corner over Steady's stall, where the weight of the accumulated snow had found a weakness in the old boards, and opened it, not dramatically. No collapse, no catastrophe, but enough that there was a wet patch on the stall floor, and the gelding had been standing away from it, unimpressed. She stood on the ladder she'd dragged from the equipment shed and examined it with cold hands and thought about what she knew about roof repairs, which was not much, but was more than nothing, because she'd watched Gideon patch the smaller hole on the chicken coop in November and had paid attention. She was still on the ladder when he came around the corner of the barn. Come down from there, he said. I can see the whole seam from here, she said. It's not as bad as it looks. If we can get tar paper over this section before the next snowfall, we won't lose the board underneath. A pause from below. You're not wrong, he said. Come down anyway. The ladder's not set right. She looked down at the ladder. He was correct. The left foot was on uneven ground, and the whole thing had a slight list she'd been compensating for without thinking about it. She came down. He reset the ladder properly and went up himself, examined what she'd identified, came back down. "Good catch," he said. "We'll do it this afternoon if the temperature holds." "I can do it," she said, "if you need to check the upper line." He looked at her. "You know how?" "I watched you do the coop," she said, "and I've been thinking about how you'd approach the angle differently up here. I might do it wrong, but I'd rather try and have you fix what I did wrong than not try." He was quiet for a moment. "All right," he said. "Supplies are in the left cabinet in the equipment shed. The tar paper roll is behind the door. Take the good hammer, not the one with the loose head." "Which one's got the loose head?" "The one with the crack in the handle," he said. "I keep meaning to replace it." "I can fix the handle too if you have a spare grip." He looked at her for a moment with an expression she'd only started being able to read in the last few weeks. Something between assessment and something warmer that he kept at a careful distance from the surface. Then he turned toward the trail. "Bottom shelf in the equipment shed," he said, already walking. "Brown paper bag." She fixed the roof seam. It was not beautiful work. The tar paper overlapped unevenly on the left side, and she had to come down twice to adjust the ladder when her angle on the lower screws wasn't working, but it was solid. She pressed the seam with her thumb along the full length of it, and there was no give. When the next storm came, this corner would hold. She fixed the hammer too while she was at it, because the spare grip was right there and the process was straightforward, and she'd always found it easier to do a thing while she was thinking about it than to put it down and remember to come back. Gideon came back from the upper line in the last of the afternoon light and went to check Steady's stall and stood for a moment looking at the repaired seam. She was at the workbench cleaning the tools she'd used, and she didn't watch him, just listened. "Left side's off," he said. "I know," she said. "It'll hold, though." "It'll hold," he agreed. He came out of the stall. He saw the hammer on the bench, the new grip fitted clean on the handle. He picked it up, tested the weight of it, set it down. He didn't say anything, but she noticed that he put the hammer in the prime position on the tool rack rather than back in the catch-all where the broken things lived, and she considered that sufficient commentary. The days that followed the storm had a different quality than the days before it. Not dramatically different, not the kind of change you could point to and name, but a shift she felt in the texture of ordinary things. She slept differently. Not well, not yet, not in the uncomplicated way she'd once taken for granted before sleep became a thing you approached with strategy, but longer, and with fewer of the jarring returns to wakefulness in the small hours. She ate more. She noticed she'd stopped automatically calculating where the exits were every time she entered a room. She noticed it on a Tuesday, specifically, because it was laundry day. She'd started calling it laundry day, had started structuring the week that way, Monday wood, Tuesday laundry, and so on, the kind of rhythm that builds a life. And she was at the basin working through a pile of Gideon's work shirts when she realized she'd been standing there for 20 minutes without once thinking about Silas. 20 minutes where her head had been occupied entirely with the temperature of the water and the particular stubbornness of pine pitch, and the question of whether the torn collar on the oldest shirt was worth mending or past it. 20 minutes of nothing but the present. She stood still for a moment when she realized it, the way you stop when you notice something delicate, not wanting to disturb it. Then she went back to the laundry, and it stayed. The conversation happened on a Thursday evening in the third week after the storm, and like most of the significant things between them, it arrived without announcement, sideways, in the middle of something mundane. She'd been asking about the spring trapline, when he'd start extending it, how the routes changed when the snow receded, and he'd been answering in his economical way, and then she'd asked about the map on the wall, the hand-drawn one she'd been looking at for months, and whether he'd drawn it himself. "Mostly," he said. "First 3 years up here, I was still learning the terrain. Drew it wrong in places, and corrected as I went." "I can see the corrections," she said, leaning over the table to look at it. There were sections in a different pencil, slightly different pressure. "What's this area here?" She pointed to a section north of the upper line, beyond the range she'd been on. "High Basin," he said. "About 4 miles above the upper line. It's rough going, shale and ice most of the year. Not worth trapping. But you go up there." A pause. "Sometimes." "Why?" Another pause. Longer. She looked at him, He was looking at the map rather than at her, but not the kind of looking that was actually seeing, the kind that was managing what was on his face. "There's a view from the north edge of the basin," he said. "You can see about 60 miles on a clear day, all the way to the Calderwall Range." He paused again. Margaret liked it up there. The name settled into the room like the first snow settling into the yard, quietly changing the shape of things. She didn't say anything. She'd learned that some sentences needed space around them rather than response. "My wife," he said, not correcting anything. She'd already understood, just naming it. "She died 6 years ago, before I put the advertisement in. I want to be clear about that." "I know," she said. "I mean, I didn't know the specifics, but I knew there'd been someone." "The photograph," he said. "The photograph," she agreed. He was quiet for a moment. She watched his hands, which were flat on the table on either side of the map, still. I want you to know I'm not comparing you to her. I'm not looking for a replacement. I don't think a person replaces another person." "No," she said, "they don't." "I placed that advertisement because I'd been up here alone for 2 years, and I understood that the aloneness had become—" He stopped, seemed to be selecting words the way he always did, carefully, from a limited supply. "It had become a habit that was going to calcify if I let it go much longer, and I didn't want to calcify." She looked at him. The firelight was doing what it always did, making the familiar room look slightly different than it looked in daylight, and his face in it was the face she'd been reading for months. The particular geography of it, the strong jaw, and the silver at his temples, and the eyes that gave away less than most people's, but that she'd been learning to read the way she'd learned to read the sky. A thing that required attention and patience, and the willingness to be wrong before you were right. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Yes." "Did you love her very much?" He looked at her steadily. "Yes," he said. No hesitation, no qualification. Just yes. "Good," she said. He looked slightly surprised. "Good?" "It means you know what it looks like," she said. "Loving someone well, it means you know what it's supposed to feel like." She paused, because this was the edge of something she'd been approaching slowly for weeks, the way you approach a frozen creek edge, testing the ice. I've never had that reference point. I didn't have the version of it that showed me what was supposed to be possible. So everything I was given I thought was normal because I had nothing to compare it to. He was very still across the table. "I'm not saying that to make you feel sorry for me," she said. "I'm saying it because—" She looked at the map, at the hand-drawn lines of the trap route, at the corrections made in different pencil when the original turned out to be wrong. "Because you've shown me something different, this year. The way you—" She made a small gesture, knowing it was inadequate, doing it anyway. "The way you are. It's recalibrated something in me that needed recalibrating." The fire popped. A log shifted. Outside, the mountain breathed through the spruce trees in its low, constant voice. "Eliza," he said. "I'm not asking for anything," she said quickly. "I don't need you to—" "I know," he said. "I know you're not asking." He was quiet for a moment. Then he reached across the table and put his hand over hers, both hands, warm and calloused, covering her cold ones, and held there. Not a declaration, not a performance, just a man putting his hands over a woman's because the moment required it, and he was present enough to know that. She didn't pull away. She looked at their hands on the map, on top of the hand-drawn lines of the life he'd built up here in the mountains, and she felt something she had been feeling for a long time finally arrive at the surface where she could see it. "I'm glad you came," he said. "I'm glad I came too," she said. They sat there for a while. The fire burned down and he got up to feed it, and she moved her hands back to her lap, and they were quiet for a long time. Not the silence of avoidance or tension, but the silence of two people who had said what needed saying and were resting in the space after it. Later, before she went to bed, she stood at the window for a few minutes, looking out at the dark mountain. The sky was clear, the deep clear that came after storms, the clarity that felt almost aggressive after days of white nothing, And the stars over the Frostpine Range were impossible. The kind of stars you forgot existed until you were far enough from everything else to see them again. She thought about the woman she'd been at the bus station. The $43, the bruised jaw, the way she'd held herself during those hours of waiting, compact and careful and constantly braced. She thought about the porch steps she'd repaired badly, and the barn roof she'd repaired well enough, and the rifle above the door that she could now handle with a steadiness that would have been unrecognizable to the woman who'd flinched and apologized and learned to make herself small. She thought about standing in the yard with the snow coming down and watching Silas's truck turn around and drive away down the mountain, and the feeling aftersick, not triumph, something quieter and more permanent than triumph. She thought about Gideon's hands over hers on the map. She wasn't fixed. She wanted to be clear about that with herself, even standing here where nobody could see her. She still startled at sudden sounds. She still had mornings where the old fear arrived before she was fully awake, where she had to spend the first 10 minutes of the day reminding herself where she was and that she was safe. She still had things inside her that were going to take years to work through, and some of them might never fully resolve, and she was learning to make a kind of peace with that. But she was not who she'd been. The mountain had done what Gideon had said on that first drive up. She'd gotten used to it. Not in the sense of it being small or manageable. It was still enormous and still fundamentally indifferent to her existence, but in the sense of understanding it well enough to live inside it, of knowing its language, of knowing which clouds meant what and which silences were warning and which were just silence. She'd learned to read the mountain, and in the process of doing that, she'd learned something else. That the same attention you paid to the world outside could be paid to the world inside. That the same patience you gave a storm could be given to grief or fear. That most things you couldn't fix by force but could outlast by simply remaining. She remained. That was the whole of it, really. Everything else was footnote. She had remained, and the remaining had changed her. She turned away from the window. The cabin was warm and quiet. The fire settled to its evening state. The good solid smell of wood smoke and pine, and the particular smell of this specific place that she could no longer distinguish as foreign because it had become, in the months between February and now, simply what home smelled like. She went to bed and lay in the dark and listened to the mountain breathe, and she slept without waiting for bad things to happen, and that, in the accounting of a life like hers, was not a small thing. It was not a small thing at all. Spring came to the Frostpine Mountains the way most real things come. Not all at once, not dramatically, but in increments so small you almost missed them, until one morning you stepped outside and realized the world had changed while you were paying attention to other things. It started with the light. The angle of it shifted sometime in late February, subtle enough that she didn't register it consciously at first, just noticed that the afternoons lasted a few minutes longer than they had the week before. Then the sound of the snow changed, the quality of it underfoot, a slight shift from the dry creak of deep winter to something with more give, more water content. Then one morning she went out to feed the horses and heard, from somewhere in the spruce trees to the east, a bird she hadn't heard since before Christmas. Not one of the year-round birds she'd catalogued through the winter. Not a jay or a raven, or the small brown things whose names she'd been slowly learning from Gideon's battered field guide, but something else. Something that didn't live here in the cold months and had come back. She stood in the barn doorway and listened to it for a full minute before she went back inside. "The thrushes are back," she told Gideon. He was at the stove. He turned around and looked at her with the particular expression he had when she said something that surprised him in a way he hadn't expected, which was the same expression as all his other expressions, but with a very slight adjustment around the eyes that she could now read accurately about 70% of the time. "You've been learning the birds," he said. "I've been learning everything," she said. She poured herself coffee and sat at the table, and the ordinary morning proceeded, and she held the thrush in her mind like a small, warm thing she'd found and wanted to keep. That was March. By April, the snow line had retreated up the mountain's face, and the lower meadow appeared again, brown and flattened and exhausted-looking from the weight of winter, but unmistakably, stubbornly present. The creek that ran past the east side of the property, which had been a sound under ice for months, opened up noisily in the first warm week, and she stood on the bank one afternoon and watched the water move and felt something move in herself in a similar way, something loosening, releasing, the particular giving way of things that have been frozen for a long time and are finally returning to motion. There was a letter from Clara in Calloway Creek, delivered by the supply man who came up in April once the road was passable. Clara, who had witnessed their marriage with the resigned tact of a woman who'd seen most things, who had told her once that Gideon was a decent man in the particular tone that meant she'd decided Eliza could be trusted with that information. The letter was short and covered the Calloway Creek news with the efficient thoroughness of a small-town person who understood that news was a form of connection. The Hendersons had a new baby, the post office roof had finally been replaced, old Morris Cale had sold his property east of town to a young couple from the valley who were going to try beef cattle and probably find out why Morris had stopped trying beef cattle 15 years ago. And then, at the end, in Clara's no-nonsense handwriting, your brother came through town about 3 weeks after your visitor, didn't stop, kept driving south. Thought you'd want to know. Eliza read that last paragraph twice. Then she folded the letter and set it on the shelf and went back to what she'd been doing, which was turning the kitchen garden plot that she and Gideon had staked out along the south wall of the cabin where the sun hit longest. The ground was still cold and rocky, and the turning of it was hard, slow work that left her arms aching. She kept turning it, kept driving south. The phrase sat in her mind while she worked, not painfully, just present. Her brother had come back to Calloway Creek and then kept going, and she thought about what that meant and decided it meant exactly what it looked like. A man recalculating, redirecting his investment of attention towards something that would yield better returns. Silas was not a man who wasted effort. Once a thing stopped being worth the effort, he moved on. She had stopped being worth the effort. She pressed her boot onto the shovel and drove it into the cold mountain earth and thought, good, that's good. Let that be the end of it. It wasn't without grief, exactly. She wouldn't be honest if she called it clean. He was her brother. Whatever he'd done and been, he was the only blood she had left. And somewhere in the complicated layering of a person's interior, there was a place where that meant something regardless of what he'd taken from her. She didn't pretend the place wasn't there. She just didn't let it make decisions for her anymore. She kept turning the garden. By the time Gideon came back from the upper line that evening, she'd cleared and turned a plot 15 feet by 8, which was more than they'd planned for the first year, and her back ached and her hands had 2 new blisters, and she was unreasonably satisfied with all of it. He stood at the edge of the plot and looked at it. That's more than we staked, he said. I know, she said. I kept going. He looked at her. What are you planning to put in the extra space? I don't know yet, she said. But I wanted the option. He was quiet for a moment, then, we'll need more seed then. I can call it into the Calloway Creek order. Already wrote it out, she said. It's on the table. He went inside. She heard him pick up the paper, heard the brief pause while he read it. She began putting away the tools, her movements slow and comfortable in the way of real physical tiredness, the kind that came from work rather than from fear, and waited. You added potatoes, he said from inside. The soil's right for them on the north end of the plot. You read the soil? I read your almanac, she said, 3 times, in February, when you were on the long trap line and I ran out of other things to do. He appeared in the doorway. You read the farming almanac. Both of them, she said. The red one and the one with the broken spine. He looked at her for a moment with something that had stopped trying to stay behind his eyes. We'll add potatoes, he said. Thank you, she said. He went back inside and she stood in the garden plot and looked at the turned earth and the last of the afternoon light moving across the mountain above them. And she thought about seeds. About the specific act of putting something in the ground when you don't know for certain that spring will hold, when you can't guarantee the frost won't come back and take what you've planted. You do it anyway. You do it because the alternative is not planting, and not planting means nothing grows, and nothing growing means you're just waiting rather than living. She'd done enough waiting. The first real spring day arrived in the 2nd week of April. The kind of day that felt like an apology from the mountain for everything it had put them through. 60 degrees and clear, the snow reduced to patches in the north-facing shadows, the meadow below the cabin showing the first uncertain green at the edges. She woke up that morning and went outside in her coat and then realized she didn't need the coat and took it off and stood in her shirt sleeves in the mountain air. and it was cold enough that she'd normally have gone back in for the coat, but she didn't because it felt like a thing she needed to stand in for a minute. Gideon found her there when he came out 10 minutes later. "You'll freeze," he said. "I won't," she said. "Feel the sun." He stood beside her. She watched him close his eyes briefly, feel the sun. A man who'd been in these mountains for 8 years, who'd seen this transition dozens of times, and he still closed his eyes for it. She found that meaningful in a way she couldn't fully articulate. "I want to go up to the high basin," she said. He opened his eyes. "When the trail's clear enough," she said. "I want to see the 60-mile view." He was quiet for a moment. She knew what she was asking, not just for a hike, but for access to something private, something that had belonged to him and someone else and hadn't been shared since. She'd chosen to ask directly rather than not ask, because she'd decided that between them, directness was the form of respect she wanted to practice. "The trail's usually clear by the 3rd week of April," he said. "Then the 3rd week of April," she said. "All right," he said. They stood together in the morning sun for a while longer, not touching, not talking, just standing in the first real warmth of the year in front of the cabin. They'd been sealed inside all winter, and it was ordinary and it was enough. The trail to the high basin was exactly as hard as Gideon had described, shale and ice in the shadowed sections, a scramble over a rock field that required both hands at one point, a traverse along a narrow ledge that made her deeply aware of the drop to her left and deeply committed to not looking at it. She climbed behind him, steady, breathing through the hard parts, not talking because the altitude and the grade required too much from her lungs for conversation. They reached the north edge of the basin just past midday. She understood why Margaret had liked it. 60 miles was an abstraction until you were standing at the edge of it. The Calderwall Range rose on the far horizon, blue and enormous, and between here and there was everything, valley and ridge and river and forest, and the infinite, indifferent, spectacular geography of a country that didn't particularly know or care that she was standing in it. The sky was the deep spring blue she'd come to associate with good things. The wind at this elevation was cold and clean and tasted like nothing she'd ever tasted at lower altitude. She stood at the edge of the basin and looked at it for a long time without saying anything. Gideon stood slightly behind her and to the left, which was something she'd noticed he did, positioned himself where she could see him without turning, never directly behind her where she couldn't. She'd never told him about that specific thing, about the specific anxiety of not being able to see who was behind her. He just figured it out. She was right, Eliza said finally. She usually was, he said, and the words were simple, and the grief in them was simple too. The clean grief of someone who has learned to carry it without being crushed by it. She recognized that kind of grief. She was learning it herself for different losses. She turned around and looked at him. He was looking at the view, his face open in a way it wasn't always open, the altitude and the space doing something to the careful management of his expression. "Gideon," she said. He looked at her. "I want to stay," she said. "I want to be clear about that. I want to make sure you know that I'm not here because I had nowhere else to go, not anymore. I could go somewhere else now. I have skills, and I have the ability to earn, and I have options I didn't have in February." She paused. "I'm choosing to stay. There's a difference." He looked at her for a moment. The wind moved between them. "I know there's a difference," he said. "I wanted to say it out loud," she said, "because I've never had the option before, and I wanted to exercise it deliberately." He was quiet for a long moment. Below them, an eagle, she'd seen them occasionally now, had learned to watch for them, was riding a thermal in long, unhurried circles. She watched it while she waited for him to say whatever he was going to say. "I want to stay too," he said, in case that also needed saying out loud. She looked at him. "I'm aware this has been an unusual arrangement from the beginning," he said, with the careful deliberateness of a man navigating something important. "I'm aware I asked you to come here without being able to offer you much. I'm aware that what we have isn't—" He stopped. "It doesn't look like what most people would recognize." "No," she said. "It doesn't. I want you to know that I—" He stopped again. Gideon Voss, who chose every word from a limited supply and didn't waste them, was working for these words in a way she'd never seen him work, and she waited with the patience she'd learned here on this mountain, in this man's company. "I'm glad you're here," he said. "I'm glad you're the person you are, and I want to keep building what we're building, whatever that is." She looked at him for a moment, at this difficult, decent, imperfect man standing at the edge of a 60-mile view, with the wind in his hair and his heart in his hands, doing his level best with language that didn't come naturally to him. "That's enough," she said. "That's more than enough." They came down from the high basin in the late afternoon with the sun behind them and the meadow below turning gold in the slant light, and she was tired and her legs hurt from the descent, and she had a scrape on her palm from the rock scramble that was going to be annoying for a week, and she was happy. Not the fragile, anxious, waiting for it to collapse kind, the kind that sat in your body like something solid, the kind that felt like it had been built rather than stumbled into. That was April. May brought the garden in earnest. She started the seedlings in the cabin window, tomatoes and squash and the potatoes, which needed to go in the ground as soon as it was workable. And she checked them every morning with the particular attention of someone responsible for something that depended on them, which was a feeling she'd only ever had for herself before, and which felt different directed outward. The seedlings grew, not evenly, not perfectly. The tomatoes were leggy from not quite enough light, and something got to 2 of the squash before they were established, but they grew. Gideon built an extension on the south wall of the cabin through May. Not for any urgent reason, just because the storage space had always been insufficient, and spring was the time for construction, and he worked at it in the methodical way he worked at everything, a few hours each day, measuring twice and cutting once, and not complaining about any of it. She helped when he needed a second set of hands and stayed out of the way when he didn't. And they negotiated the project the way they negotiated most things. Not with formal discussion, but with the particular attentiveness of 2 people who had learned to read each other and adjust accordingly. One evening in the second week of May, he asked her something he'd never asked before. "What did you want?" he said. "When you were young, before." She was at the table mending a jacket, and she looked up. He was across from her, not looking at her, apparently focused on the knife he was sharpening, but she'd learned that when Gideon seemed to be looking at something else, he was often doing his most careful listening. "I wanted to be a teacher," she said. He looked up at that. "Primary school," she said. "Small children. I was good with them. I used to think—" She paused, because this was a memory she'd had for a long time and hadn't looked at directly in years. "I used to think if I could just get my certification, I could get a position somewhere far enough away that I'd have a real reason to leave. That was my plan when I was 19. She was quiet. "Silas took the money I'd been saving. I never made it back to even." Gideon was still. "I'm not saying that so you feel sorry for me," she said, the same thing she'd said to him once before, months ago, which he'd responded to the right way then, and which she trusted him to respond to the right way now. "I know," he said. "I asked because I wanted to know." She looked at the jacket in her hands. "Why?" "Because the people we were going to be matter," he said. "Even if they didn't happen." She sat with that for a moment. "You wanted to be something else too?" "I wanted to build things," he said. "Structures, buildings." He nodded toward the half-finished extension on the south wall. "I do build things. Just not—" A pause. "Not on the scale I'd imagined." "Is that a regret?" He considered it honestly, the way he considered everything. "Some days," he said, "less than it used to be." She looked at him across the table. "Could I write to the county education office? I'm not talking about leaving. Callaway Creek has a school. It's only 11 miles. He looked at her steadily. "You could go to school in Callaway Creek and live here?" "I could go 3 days a week in the late spring and early fall," she said, "when the road's good and the trap line doesn't need full attention. You'd have to manage the lower loop alone on those days." She paused. "But you did it alone for years." "I did," he said. "I'm not asking permission," she said carefully. "I'm working through it out loud because it affects both of us, and I think that means we should think about it together." He was quiet for long enough that she prepared herself for some version of no, or not now, or the practical objections that were certainly there. The distance, the road in bad weather, the work. She prepared herself and found, in the preparing, that she was ready to hear it and negotiate it and not collapse under the weight of it, which was itself a kind of answer to a question she'd been carrying since February. "Write to them," he said. "See what they say." She looked at him. "You'd be a good teacher," he said. "That seemed clear to me about halfway through your first month here." "Because I organized the canned goods?" "Because you pay attention," he said. "And you're patient when something isn't working. Those are the things that matter." She turned back to the jacket in her hands and took 3 careful stitches while she held herself together, because she was not going to cry over canned goods and someone noticing that she was patient. She was not, and she managed it, barely. "Thank you," she said. "Write the letter tonight," he said, "before you think of reasons not to." She wrote it that night. Gideon sharpened 2 knives and the axe and didn't comment on the fact that she rewrote the opening paragraph 4 times, which he must have heard her doing, and she sealed the envelope and put it with the outgoing mail for the next supply run and then sat back and breathed. The letter went out. Spring deepened. The garden came up. Not all of it. She lost the squash to a late frost in the 3rd week of May that she should have seen coming and didn't. And she stood at the garden plot the morning after and looked at the blackened leaves and felt the particular deflation of something preventable, something she could have protected if she'd read the signs right. She stood there for a while. Then she pulled the dead plants, turned the soil over the spaces they'd occupied, and replanted with seed she had left over, because the season wasn't finished and a failed first planting wasn't the end. That was something she understood now at a cellular level. A failed first attempt wasn't the end. You assessed, you adjusted, you replanted if you had seed left, and if you didn't have seed left, you figured out what else could go in the ground. The county education office wrote back in June. Yes, they had a position at Callaway Creek Primary School. It was part-time, 3 days a week, beginning in September. The salary was modest. Would she like to come down for an interview? She read the letter 3 times, standing at the kitchen window. Gideon was on the porch when she came out. He looked at her face. "September," she said. He nodded once. "The trap line runs different in September anyway," he said. "I'll adjust the lower loop schedule." "Just like that?" she said. "Just like that," he said. She looked at him. This man who had placed an honest advertisement and meant it, who had handed her a rifle and taught her to press instead of pull, who had stood beside her in the yard in the snow and let her fight her own fight, who had put his hands over hers on a map and said, "I'm glad you came." This imperfect, private, difficult, decent man who had become, somewhere in the months between one winter and the next, the clearest evidence she had that people could be other than what she'd learned they were. She crossed the porch and sat beside him, and he moved over without being asked, the way he always moved over, making room. They sat together in the June afternoon while the mountain did what it did, absorbed the light, breathed through its trees, conducted the business of being enormous and indifferent and impossibly beautiful in the way of things that will outlast everything and don't particularly need to be thanked for it. She thought about what she'd carry from this year if she were asked to name it. Not the confrontation in the yard, though that mattered, not the card games or the rifle lessons or the barn roof or the climb to the high basin, though those mattered too. What she would carry was smaller than all of that and larger at the same time. She would carry the 2 chairs at the table in a cabin where one person had lived for 8 years. She would carry the horse with the honest name. She would carry the knowledge that strength could be quiet, that the most reliable people were often the least dramatic, that the measure of a man was not what he said when things were easy, but what he did when they weren't, and that a woman could rebuild herself from $43 and a 9-sentence letter if the conditions were right and she was willing to do the work. She would carry the understanding that freedom wasn't the absence of difficulty. It was the ability to choose which difficulty was yours. It was standing in a yard in the snow and saying no to the thing that had always said no to you. It was waking up in the dark and knowing where you were. It was planting things in cold ground because you intended to be there when they came up. The summer moved through the frost pine range in its brief, abundant way, the kind of summer that reminded you why people stayed in hard places. Because the hard places, in the good months, were astonishing. The meadow filled up. The creek ran full and cold. The garden produced more than she'd realistically planned for, and she found herself learning to preserve and store and manage surplus, which led to 3 different conversations with Clara over 3 different supply trips, and which led Clara to suggest, matter-of-factly, that she knew 3 other families in the valley who'd pay well for mountain-grown produce. And so, without quite deciding to, Eliza Voss became a woman who grew things and sold them and taught children and lived in the mountains with a man who was steady. None of it was easy. The road in early fall was unreliable, and she missed 2 planned trips down to Callaway Creek. One of the students in her class had a home situation that reminded her too much of her own and cost her several nights of sleep. The garden produced more squash than they could use or sell, and they ate squash in more configurations than she had previously believed possible. Gideon pulled a muscle in his back in October doing something he'd been doing for years, which meant 2 weeks of him refusing to accept as much help as he needed, and her working around his refusal with the patience she'd been told she had, and was only now actually practicing. They disagreed sometimes, not often and not with cruelty, but with the genuine friction of 2 people who had formed their habits alone and were still in the slow process of making room for each other's different ways of doing things. She wanted the firewood stacked by type. He had always stacked it by size. They had that conversation twice before arriving at a system that was neither of their original preferences, but that worked better than both. That felt important to her too, that the answer to 2 different methods wasn't one person conceding to the other, but the 2 of them working out a third thing, something that hadn't existed before, that belonged to both of them because they'd made it together. That, she thought, was what they were. Not her old life, not Gideon's old life, not a compromise between them. Something third, something they were building one ordinary day at a time out of patience and friction and mutual respect and the slow, stubborn work of choosing each other again each morning, not because it was easy, but because it was true. Autumn came, and the mountain put on the brief, extravagant show it made each year before the cold returned. The aspens on the south slope going gold, the sky deepening to the blue she associated now with good things, the air carrying the smell of pine and turning leaves, and the first distant cold edge that meant winter was thinking about coming back. She stood in the garden on the last harvest day of the year, pulling the remaining plants, her hands dirty and cold, the light going golden red over the tree line, and she thought about the woman who had arrived here in February with nothing. She turned it over, tried to find the point where nothing had become something, and couldn't find it, because it hadn't been a point, hadn't been a moment, had been instead this long accumulation of ordinary days and small decisions and the consistent refusal to give up on a life she was still in the process of figuring out how to live. She heard the cabin door open behind her. She heard Gideon's footsteps on the frozen ground. "It's getting dark," he said. "I know," she said. "I'm almost done." He came and crouched beside her and started pulling the last of the root vegetables from the far end of the plot. Not because she couldn't do it herself, but because the work was there and he was there, and that was simply how they did things now. They worked until the light was almost gone, side by side in the mountain air, and then they gathered what they'd pulled and carried it to the cold storage, and went inside where the fire was burning and the cabin was warm, and the 2 chairs sat at the table the way they always had, waiting. She washed her hands. He put water on. She sat. Outside, the frost pine mountains held the dark the way they held everything. Completely, without apology, indifferent to the smallness of the human lives conducted in their shadow, and yet, somehow, because of that very indifference, making those lives feel more rather than less significant. More deliberate, more chosen. She had chosen this. Every day she chose it again. That was the whole answer, as far as she could tell. Not a dramatic revelation, not a single moment of transformation, just the daily, imperfect, entirely human act of choosing the life you want to be living and then getting up the next morning and choosing it again. She picked up her cup. Across the table, Gideon picked up his. The fire burned, the mountain breathed, and Eliza Voss, who had once stood at a bus station in the dark with $43 and a bruised jaw and one desperate plan, sat in her own home in the life she had built from nothing but nerve and work and the stubborn refusal to believe that this was all there was, and found that it was, against all reasonable expectation, enough. More than enough. It was everything.